Hey, what's up guys? My name is the Cherno. Welcome back to another episode of the Game Engine series. So last time we basically implemented our camera component UI. Check out that video if you haven't already. And today we're going to be just progressing through our checklist. You know, having a roadmap is so nice. Having like some kind of, goal that you've planned for and you've actually like developed a strategy to get there is really important. I actually made a video recently about the importance of like long-term planning and road mapping and all of that stuff. I'll link it up there in case you're interested. But I honestly, it's amazing just being able to sit down and everything's just here. Like I know exactly what I'm working on. It's so easy. And without further ado, let's actually start doing some of that work. So in the roadmap, which anyone can access, hazelengine.com/roadmap, we have this Hazelnut UI MVP that we're working towards. Next up is apparently the tag component UI and the Sprite Renderer component UI. So we did the camera component last time and now we're doing these two. And the next episode we'll probably go to transform component. Now these obviously don't need an episode each. In fact, I'm pretty sure this is mostly done. We're about to investigate that. But this is, this Sprite Renderer component UI needs to be done today, and then this stuff we can look at next time. So if we just quickly have a run of this Hazel engine, let's take a look at what we've got here and what we actually need to do. So we need to, so what we've got at the moment is this weird clip space entity, which as far as I'm concerned is just a camera, right? So if we enable it, you can see it moves the camera because if we set this camera to primary, I mean. So I don't know why it's called this clip space entity. It's actually like some kind of camera B or something like that. It's funny how that moves because the WASD keys move the camera, and I guess I pressed A couple times here. That's a camera. Cool. We've got the camera entity, which is another camera, obviously. That's currently the primary camera. If we disable it, then we have no cameras, so nothing renders. We've got the red square, which is what we see here, and we've actually got the green square as well that's on the same position. So if we move that out of the way, you can see it's over here. Now, at the moment, if we actually do look at this, you can see that in the settings panel over here, we actually have green square and then the square color. So this just happens to be bound to this particular square. So if I click on this, I can cycle through all the colors you can see, and it's modifying this green square. Let's set it back to green so we're not confused. So obviously this is not something we want to manually bind to this IMGUI settings panel. That was just temporary. We want to actually be able to control like the color and maybe potentially other properties of the Sprite Renderer inside this properties panel, because the Sprite Renderer is actually a component that is on our, well, green square in this case, or really on any entity. Now this becomes a bit more, I guess it's a bit deeper than that, because if you think about how a Sprite Renderer component usually works, it's usually tied to a material. So good, you have a Sprite Renderer, right? You have an entity and you want to render a sprite in place of that entity, with the entity's transform and all of that. But what kind of sprite is it? Does it have a texture? Does it have a color? What color is it? What shader should I be using for this? All of those questions basically point to, hey man, you need a material, right? Now we don't have a material system at the moment. So in the future, when we have a Sprite Renderer component, we should have it take in a material. That way we can make a, just a weird reflective sprite if we want to, maybe. I mean, that wouldn't really make too much sense, I guess, for a 2D game, but maybe our sprite is some kind of like arbitrary shader that generates the actual sprite itself, right? So it might be something that's just generated on the fly. Maybe it's a particular texture. Maybe it's, you guys kind of get the point. It could be anything. It could be really any material. But at this point, it's just simply a color, and I don't even think we can assign a texture to it. Now, it'd be nice to assign a texture to it, and I think we will extend it to be like that in the future. But for now, I believe it's just this. In fact, the way that we render sprites at the moment should mean that the actual color can be set to white, and then we can have a texture that's by default a 1x1 white texture. And that way it actually doesn't matter. We could have both. We could have both a color and a texture, and then the color would tint the texture if the texture is present. Otherwise it would just obviously show up like this because the texture is white. So in other words, we should actually be able to easily set a texture onto the sprite component if we want to. Anyway, point is we just have a transform component for these two because that's all they have. They have a transform component, a tag component, and then also a sprite renderer component, which is what we're going to add the UI for today. Now I want to quickly mention that the tag component, which is what we actually saw, was something that we need to do. Well, I'm very overexposed. Light, shield myself. The tag component UI is also something we need to look at. So as far as I'm concerned, that's basically done. I mean, we've got this tag component. Like obviously the labels appear on the right side and that's wrong, and we'll fix that later in the polishing UI stage. But for now, this looks great, and obviously it's fully functional. You can see I can rename this to rename this to like anything I want, and obviously it will update. So as far as I'm concerned, tag component is in fact done. We can look at the code for that, but I'm pretty sure it's fine. So we'll be mostly focusing on the Sprite Renderer component. So whenever you're designing the UI for something like this, the easiest way to do this, and in fact the way that I usually do this, is I simply look at our components and I see, okay, what on earth is in the Sprite Renderer component? At the moment, literally just a color, right? That's all it contains. Now this should potentially contain a texture, as I mentioned, but more correctly, it should probably contain some kind of material from our material library, maybe even a material instance, right? And then the way that this would kind of work is you need to have some kind of Sprite compatible shader and material. So you could have a shader that just simply draws a textured quad or something like that. And then obviously a material is, we haven't talked about materials at all really, but a material is a shader plus any kind of uniform data. So a shader plus data. And so what you would have in this case is potentially the shader being like our texture shader, and then like an actual texture or an actual color value like this, right? So that's how it would work. And a material obviously is capable of holding both the shader and the data. So that would be all there, and that'd be fine. And we would just need to provide some kind of UI for that, which we could pretty much automatically do, because if we query the shader and we find out, hey, what uniforms do you have available to us, you know, that you're exposing into a material instance or a material, we can automatically probably generate some UI for that. So we don't even have to worry about this too much. But we could also have a custom tailored kind of solution for the Sprite Renderer component specifically, because we know that that's something that we more or less, you know, it's not like it's infinite possibilities. A Sprite Renderer is a Sprite Renderer, and in most cases, you'll be either rendering like a colored sprite or some kind of texture, and that's kind of it. Anyway, that being said, our job's pretty easy here today. We can probably talk about how to get a texture into this, because at this point, you guys kind of get the point of how we add components now. All we have to do, the camera component was pretty meaty, right? It was pretty large because we had this whole kind of block here to write, and obviously we had different types of cameras as well, but this is a lot easier, right? You know, if we copy the transform component as an example, the Sprite Renderer component is a lot better. So let's just implement that. So we have a Sprite Renderer component. We'll use the Sprite Renderer's component type ID hash code just as this little temporary ID for IMGUI. We will type in Sprite Renderer over here. And then the transform obviously needs to go away, and we'll, I mean, you know, realistically, this is just going to be IMGUI color edit. Now, we'll use a color edit 4, of course, because I believe our Sprite Renderer, so if we go to our components, it has a vec4, right? So we also have alpha there. Important you use this. That way you can manipulate the alpha using the IMGUI thing as well. I never remember if I want color edit or color picker. So color edit functions have a little color preview square that can be left clicked, right? And a picker is the actual picker inline. So we want the edit because we want to be able to just have a little square that we click on to expand the actual color picker. So that is good. I just read that using the kind of documentation in the comments provided by IMGUI. So this is going to be the color, essentially. Again, very basic kind of baby steps at the moment. And the color is going to be, if we basically do the same thing here, so we'll do Sprite component, SC, or Sprite Renderer component, SRC. And then this will be a Sprite Renderer component, and that's what we'll retrieve. And then this is just going to be src.color. And of course, we can just use our classic GLM value pointer to give us a pointer to that array of 4 floats. That's it, I think. Yeah, it's pretty simple, isn't it? So you saw how quick that was. I mean, adding a new component to the UI, like really, really fast. Now, this is still not something I would label as ideal, because if you look at this, for example, we're repeating this code pretty much every time. So for every single component, we have this kind of same pattern. We've got, does it exist? Does it have it? And then take the type ID of it, call it by its name, and then the rest goes here, right? And then we have to have end tree pop as well. So what we'll do in the future is something that we do in Hazel Dev, which is basically we just make a function called and we'll talk about that next time maybe, or the time after, we'll see. We call it draw component, right? It's a templated function that just takes in the name of the component and then potentially what you actually want to call it. And then it also takes in a lambda where you can just add your component specific UI code. And that way, when we actually make the IMGUI code a little bit more complicated, I think it probably makes sense to do this in the polish UI stage. That way, when we actually make our UI component, our component UI more complicated and like with labels on the left side and all this other extra IMGUI code that we have to write, it's more standardized, meaning that like we don't have to, we only put the camera specific stuff here, which in this case would be, you know, the color edit for and like, you know, retrieving this. So in other words, in this case, this would actually go there. And that is exactly what our camera component UI would look like. Everything else is automated or kind of automatically done by this draw component function because it's the same for each component. And we want it to be exactly the same for each component because we want it to be consistent in styling, right? So that's something that we'll do in the future. If you want a little bit more of an exercise and some homework, perhaps, to do for Hazel, try and do this yourself. You know, based on what I've kind of shown you right here, just convert the component system yourself so that you can basically write some code that looks somewhat like this. If it looks even cleaner, then great, right? Something like this so that we can just, you know, draw the camera component, draw the sprite renderer component, etc., right? And it's like super easy, and you can just do stuff like that and add the specific UI here, but everything else is automatic. And you can even have a go at like making the labels be on the left side and all of that. If you do come up with something that you think looks really good in terms of UI styling, then just submit a pull request or open an issue on the Hazel engine repository, which is just github.com/thecherno/Hazel, link in the description. And then, yeah, maybe we'll adopt your style because I'm obviously, you know, I want this to look good. And if the community wants to help, then amazing. Okay, so anyway, now that that's pretty much done, let's just hit F5, take a look at what this looks like. Okay, everything was canceled apparently. Sometimes Visual Studio can be just a complete ball of fun. So in this case, we actually have to restart everything. So let me just close this. Yeah, I know. Sometimes Visual Studio is, as I said, a ball of fun. Ball of fun. The stream likes that, by the way. You can't see the chat on stream, but stream likes it. Shout out to the breaking hit randomly. Let's hit F5. And now everything magically works. So, you know, just Visual Studio things, that's all. Okay, so now that we've got this on screen, we should be able to click on the square and look, magically, we can see the color here, it's green here, it's red here. We know we have a sprite renderer component, it's automatically expanded. There's our little color picker. We can drag this over and it displays everything here. Now I'm interested in alpha, so can we reduce the alpha? We can, in fact. And for some reason, I'm not actually seeing the green square, even though we're reducing the alpha, right? So if I reduce the alpha here, that's just not here at all. And if I move it a little bit, and the reason this is happening most likely is because I think we've got depth testing enabled, but also it's just based on the render order. So red square happens to be most likely rendered first, and at that point it can't blend with anything because there's just the clear color inside the depth buffer and inside the color buffer. And then finally, when the depth buffer doesn't matter too much here, but when the green square gets rendered on top of that, it's opaque anyway, so it doesn't matter. On the green square, if we did reduce the alpha, I'm pretty sure it would blend with the red square, although I'm completely wrong, it seems. So maybe blending is just disabled or something like that. That's kind of weird, isn't it? And we've still got this kind of control over here. So yeah, it seems like we just can't get these two to blend. Most likely because blending is disabled. Anyway, this is not really what I wanted to do this episode, but what happened to GL blend? That's weird. Blending is disabled, but it can't be. I'm pretty sure it's enabled. Yeah, we had GL enable and then source alpha 1 minus source alpha. That's weird. I guess it's possible they're at the same depth. When we're rendering, we're not going to talk about 2D rendering specifically today. Yeah, actually, I think it's because they're Z fighting or they're at the same depth. We're not going to talk about that specifically today, but just so you know, usually when you're rendering true 2D things, you just render them back to front, so stuff in the background goes first, and then you just disable depth test because you don't need it. You just render back to front, and then everything usually is okay. So that technically is what you would probably do if you were actually truly making a 2D game. So that would look something like when we actually draw the quads and we go through Although that wouldn't work with a batch rendering situation, because obviously we draw stuff kind of at once, so it's a bit weird. So in that case, I think that we would need to probably, yeah, different layers work differently as well here. But if we just select the green square, I think we'd probably need to just change the position here. So you can see that now, if we make that position a little bit different for a batch renderer, you can see that you get that kind of effect going here, because now it really is truly in front. However, if we have them both at 0, they don't really work. So that's kind of what you would do if you were rendering everything in a batch renderer, since everything kind of gets rendered at once and there's no kind of opportunity for blending, the same way as if you had everything as a separate draw call. Anyway, random information there, obviously, but there we go. We've got the ability to change the color, pretty cool. If we wanted to draw a texture, we could also set that up. I'm not sure if I want to add that stuff now because of the whole material situation, but maybe we'll do that next time, we'll see. Okay, anyway, this is the square color thing that I want to remove now, so square color. So yeah, we have this like if m square entity, and then we have the tag here. That's what said green square, and then the square color. You can just get rid of all this. And then we also had camera B, didn't we? So another checkbox here as well. We don't really need any of this stuff. We have the ortho size, I think. Like this stuff is just silly at the moment. Camera transform, that stuff obviously exists. So we'll clean up this file a little bit and all this stuff here. We'll leave the settings just basically more or less being like the render stats. So maybe I will actually call this render stats. And then, and in fact, I might call this renderer 2D stats, right? I mean, we've already got this here, right? I'll just call it stats. There'll be all sorts of stats here. What was the other thing I wanted to do? Oh yeah, this stupid clip space entity. I need to go back through the episodes and see how that came to be, because it's clearly just a camera. Maybe it used to be something else. Man. Whatever, and I guess we should call this camera A. I probably didn't make the compile here, did I? Nope. So now that we've renamed the I'm GUI panel, it has no idea where it's supposed to be, so let's snap that back and make sure that saves. So yeah, and camera, oh, that didn't work either. Why do we still have camera entity? Let's try and recompile that maybe. And then finally, what did I want to do? What was the other thing? Oh yeah, I just didn't want them to be at the same place, but I guess that's fine. Let's just hit F5. Okay, cool. So there we go. Let's move. So camera A, camera B, cool. We can enable camera B as a primary if we want, and disable camera A from the primary. All that stuff works. We should need to have that extra stuff here. We now have 2 squares as well, and we can set them up in such a way where they blend. If we just reduce the alpha and actually move this a bit forward, so that's on top of that. Okay, cool. There we go. Pretty cool. We now have the sprite renderer component. Obviously, I mean, we added like this one control here, but hopefully, some of the discussion was helpful to you guys who want to maybe extend this a bit further or for like educational purposes. And I think that next time we can happily check that off because that's currently done. We obviously still want to be able to render textures, and I'm beginning to think that maybe it's worth us kind of revising our shading and material system before we dive into that, since effectively we'd be creating temporary code anyway if we just started adding like a file picker to like open a brand new texture or something like that and then render it here. I feel like maybe we should make a materials panel and then talk about materials and different shaders and stuff like that. Let me know what you guys think about that, and if that would interest you. Maybe we'll even put that in a different place, although I think we still should probably finish this list, and then maybe next up, before seeing serialization, we can maybe start to work in a material system, because that way we'll be able to just easily construct things within Hazel here, but then also have them be textured quads, not just, colored quads here, because that can be a little bit boring. Anyway, that's it. Did we check that off? I think we did. Yeah, Sprite Renderer component UI is done. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Game Engine series. If you did, please hit that like button. If you're listening to this on Twitch, then you can follow the stream or even subscribe if you're feeling particularly generous. Don't forget that you can help support the series by going to patreon.com/the Cherno, where you get access to the Hazel Dev, like the 3D version of this engine, and all of the stuff that exists there, like C# scripting and this whole UI already done, and you can really use that to make some kind of small games. And you'll also get access to like live streams that I've done in the past as well, specifically for that 3D version of Hazel as well, if you are interested. Thank you all for watching. Have a great rest of your day or night or whatever it is. I will see you next time. Goodbye.